As a pediatric psychologist specializing in children who are victims of extreme trauma, the life of Dr. Elizabeth Reed was often surrounded by the invisible wounds of fragile young souls 13 years ago when she was still deeply immersed in that field. A horrific case completely altered the course of her career and her entire life. It was nearly 9 p.m. The time Elizabeth usually prepared for bed, she was sitting at the rolled wooden desk, flipping through notes from the day's therapy sessions. The room was bathed in a soft, warm yellow light, creating an artificial calm that sharply contrasted with the emotional chaos she had spent the day untangling. She remembered absent-mindedly nudging her glass of milk, causing a splash of cold liquid to hit her thigh. The unexpected sensation made Elizabeth jerk in surprise. In the sudden chaos, the tall glass toppled over, fell to the wooden floor, and shattered loudly. At that exact moment, the old yellow landline phone, yes, back then landlines were still common, began ringing with a shrill, piercing tone. The harsh sound of shattering glass mixed with the phone's sharp ring made her heart feel as if it might burst from her chest. Elizabeth fumbled for the pale yellow receiver with one hand, while the other tried to wipe the cold, sticky milk from her sweatpants. "Hello," she stammered, her usual professionalism scattered by her racing heartbeat. "Yes, hello," she repeated, her voice slightly calmer. She felt the surge of adrenaline slowly easing from her system. "Is this Dr. Reed?" the voice on the other end asked, attempting to confirm her identity. Elizabeth listened carefully, regaining control. "Yes, I'm here. This is Lydia Green, social worker from Blackwood County. I'm sorry to call so late, but I have a case that is somewhat extreme," Lydia said bluntly, her voice laced with a fearful urgency that told Elizabeth this was far worse than somewhat extreme. Elizabeth suspected Lydia didn't even notice the panic in her own voice as she struggled to contain her fear. "It's all right, what's happening?" Elizabeth replied immediately. She had worked with Lydia before, though it had been years. The information now was far too critical for pleasantries. As Lydia began explaining, the hair on Elizabeth's arms stood one to chill ran down her spine. The shock from the glass and the ringing phone had barely faded, and now a new heaviness settled in her stomach. The hand wiping her sweatpants froze, growing cold and clammy. Elizabeth couldn't recall every detail of the rest of the call. Lydia's ability to suppress her own fear was fading, making it difficult to hear. Everything but Elizabeth understood the core of it. Within a mooch, she found herself in her car, speeding toward the local hospitals. She had managed to switch into jeans, grateful at least that she wouldn't show up as the doctor wearing milk-stained sweatpants. The general information she'd been given about the cases she was about to face. The incoming client was a 3-year-old girl. Neighbors had called the police to check on the girl and her parents after noticing the family car hadn't moved, and mail had piled up for more than 2 weeks. This was unusual. The family typically asked neighbors to take care of their dog whenever they were away, but not this time. What the police walked into was horrific and heartbreaking. Both parents were tied to chairs in the dining room. Their throats slit from earth to earth. The wounds were so deep their necks looked like gaping mouths, nearly severing their heads. The family dog was found in the girl's bedroom, killed in the same way and dressed in doll clothes. And now the most heartbreaking part, 3-year-old Emily was also sitting at the table, unharmed and unrestrained on the tables. He had arranged small pink plastic plates, blue plastic cups, soy food, and a gallon of milk. Clearly, she had tried to pour milk into her parents' mouths, hoping to make them better. This was evidenced by the clotted milk and dried blood coating their necks and clothes. Based on the condition of the bodies, they had been dead for at least 2 weeks. The 3-year-old had been trapped in the house alone with the corpses of her parents and pet for weeks, seemingly doing the only thing she knew to try to save them, feeding them and giving them milk. The darkness of the road gave way to the blinding white and red glow of the emergency room sign. Elizabeth parked and walked in, steadying herself for the encounter ahead with the traumatized child. She had barely taken a few steps down the sterile hallway when Lydia appeared, her panic slightly subdued, but her wide eyes and disheveled hair revealing the depth of her shock. Lydia led her to the exam room. Lydia led Dr. Elizabeth Reed to a small examination room. Inside, a pair of tiny legs were dangling off the edge of the exam table, one white sock wrinkled and sagging over a black Mary Jane shoe, while the other sock was pulled all the way up to the knee. Elizabeth could not take her eyes off the sole of the shoe. A dark, glossy layer of dried blood clung stubbornly to it. The sight made her shudder with horror, imagining how many times the little girl had stepped through her. Blood even climbing onto the table to pour milk into their mouth. She suddenly remembered the spilled milk on her own floor that she had not yet cleaned. Emily was wearing a cheap pink princess dress, the kind kids buy as play costumes, but refused to take off the dress, was wrinkled with a few small hand-sized reddish-brown smudges, but was otherwise strangely clean. Her curly hair was a tangled mess, as though it had not been washed in a long time, which made perfect sense given what she had endured. One thing immediately struck Elizabeth Assad, despite being alone with the corpses of her parents for over 2 weeks. Emily looked surprisingly healthy. The little girl sat perfectly still, her tinny hands folded in her lap, her head bowed, staring at them. Her stillness made her look like a doll, an old dirty doll, butched beneath the grime in her clothes and hair. She still radiated a not innocence. Elizabeth approached slowly. "Hello, Emily, how are you feeling, sweetheart?" she said gently. The little girl did not move. Elizabeth knelt in front of Emily and softly placed one hand over the small folded hands. The touch made Emily lift her head, slightly revealing a pair of large dark eyes set in a doll-like face. Her eyes were clear and bright, but her face was completely expressionless. No sadness, no fear, just emptiness like a doll's face. She did not look Elizabeth in the eye, but somewhere lower, perhaps the mouth, and she still said nothing. She must be in shock. Elizabeth thought it would be shocking if she weren't due. "You know why you're here, sweetie?" Elizabeth asked softly. Emily slowly nodded up and down 3 times, as if to many as, "I'm Dr. Elizabeth. I know you've been through something very, very hard. You, Resafanow, Miss Lydia, and I are going to help you. Is that okay?" The girl's eyes flickered, and she looked directly into Elizabeth's eyes. They were such a deep brown. They were almost black. Elizabeth's body flinched a jolt similar to the glass shattering and the phone ringing earlier. She knew this was Ariel Child, but something about those black eyes on that angelic face didn't seem real, like watching a doll's eyes move, and without even realizing it. Elizabeth pulled her hand away, and she wondered briefly, thinking she saw something dark flicker inside the OZ eyes after holding Elizabeth's gaze for what felt like 5 minutes, but was surely only a brief moment. Emily slowly nodded again 3 times. Elizabeth knew from experience, never push a traumatized child. A good therapist lets them open up in their own way and in their own time. Miss Lydia will find very good people for you to stay with, so you'll be safe, and I'm here for you too. Kenny, you tell many things, sweetheartest. There anything you want to say? Right now, she asked gently. Emily glanced at the door where Lydia stood, then slowly shook her head side to side 3 times. Meaning no, Elizabeth and Lydia stayed with her for several more hours while doctors and nurses examined her. Emily was found perfectly healthy, not a single scratch, no even mild dehydration during the entire time. She remained motionless, only moving her head to show ye saw no most of the time. They sat in silence, not wanting to push her. In such a fragile state, after a while Lydia said she would handle their stand. Elizabeth stood to drive home, just as she stepped out of the exam room, as small child spoke softly behind her. "It was for their own good," the girl said, flat. Eli Elizabeth turned back, catching the sharp gaze of Emily staring from her expressionless face. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, what did you say?" she asked, unsure she had heard correctly. "It was for their own good," the girl repeated. Lydia stepped closer to her, and the child lowered her head, returning to her doll-like posture. Elizabeth and Lydia exchanged a stunned glance before Elizabeth stepped out the door. ASA pediatric trauma psychologist Dr. Elizabeth Reed drove home. She could not stop thinking about Emily's final words. It was for their own good. With her extensive experience handling cases where children witnessed such bloody events, she quickly formed an initial hypothesis. The most likely possibility was that this phrase was what the killer had said while murdering the girl's parents' children. Repeating the perpetrator's words is a common trauma response, an attempt to understand or reenact the horrifying event. This hypothesis gave Elizabeth a small glimmer of hope that in the coming weeks she might be able to draw more details from Emily to aid the police investigation. At the moment, the police were facing many difficulties. They found no signs of forced entry. The door lock was intact and far too high for a 3-year-old to reach, likely the main reason Emily had been trapped inside the house for so long. The girl had been completely silent during questioning, and Elizabeth never agreed with the harsh methods police often used on traumatized children. Why she was spared was still a major mystery. The dead dog, found in her room led investigators to suspect Emily had hidden under the bed or in a closed tent during the murders. Afterward, she addressed the dog much like her attempt to feed her parents milk. Perhaps she meant that it was for their own good. Her actions were all an attempt to care for her loved ones. A few days later, Elizabeth began weekly therapy sessions with Emily. The girl was placed with a local couple who had felt sympathy for her after reading the news. The early sessions were almost entirely silent. Emily always sat in the same doll-like posture, unmoving and mute. Elizabeth understood this as a thick defensive wall of a deeply wounded soul. It wasn't until the third week that Elizabeth managed to coax Emily into coloring with her. They sat together at a small table, completely silent, each coloring their own picture. It was a tiny step forward as the girl at least participated in an interactive activity. Over the next few weeks, the silence continued until one particular session. Elizabeth watched Emily using red crayon, furiously scribbling jagged, harsh lines so over the neck of a drawing of a caddis that a bow Emily Elise. Beth asked, cheerfully pointing at the marks. The girl suddenly snapped her head toward Elizabeth, piercing her with those cold black eyes. Her tinny face showed no emotion except angers. She then stood up without a word and walked to the corner of the room where a pile of stuffed animals sat. Emily chose a shaggy white stuffed dog with soft tears. She held it earth, the other hand still clenched around the red crayon. Then with shocking strength and violence, she began slashing at the dog's neck with the crayon. As she carried out the horrifying acts, she yelled, "It's for you. Roan, good, it's for your own good." After months of silence, the outburst made Elizabeth jump. Her blood seemed to freeze, her palms sweating. A voice inside her urged her to run and get help, but she held herself still. In that moment, she was certain the phrase had nothing to do with the milk. It was directly tied to the murders. "Where do you hurt that, Emily? It's for your own good," she asked gently. Emily paused here, eyes locking onto Elizabeth. She said nothing, but Elizabeth swore she saw the faintest curl of a smile at the corner of the girl's mouth. After that session, Elizabeth contacted the foster parents, who were shocked to hear such screaming through the door as they had never heard. Emily speaks. He also contacted the investigators. Elizabeth knew it wasn't much, but she shared her thoughts about the homicide reenactment behavior. They confirmed they had recently found a loose connection between Emily's father and members of a local gang. Elizabeth's description of the girl's behavior seemed to support the theory that this might have been a gang retaliation. However, in the weeks that followed, everything fell silent again. One hope. Each week, Elizabeth sat through another quiet coloring session with the doll-like child. Understood. Here is your text rewritten exactly as written, in English. One continuous line. No added or removed words. No line breaks, no bullet points. It wasn't until the fourth month of working together, when everything seemed to have reached a dead end with the weekly silent coloring sessions, that everything completely changed. Foster parents of Emily that day worked late, so Lydia Green brought the little girl to the clinic and planned to pick her up later. The therapy session began warmly, both sitting beside each other, focused on their coloring pages. And then, completely unexpectedly, Emily stood up, walked to a random toy chest, and began rummaging through it, frantically searching for something. "What are you looking for?" Elizabeth asked, trying to keep her voice calm and curious. "Shh!" The little girl turned back, placing a small finger on her tiny mouth, signaling silence. Elizabeth playfully pretended to zip her lips shut, and Emily continued searching. Elizabeth felt curious. Any change in the therapy sessions was a sign of progress, so she willingly complied. The girl pulled out a pink jump rope, the kind with cheap plastic handless and braided white pink rope. She brought it back to where Elizabeth was sitting and still silent. As usual, grabbed Elizabeth's wrists and pulled them behind the chair. She used the jump rope to tie them together. The act immediately made Elizabeth uneasy, her insides twisting. However, she remained silent. She suspected this was another reenactment of a murder case. This was a normal way for a small child to process horrific trauma, and she didn't want to ruin this chance for progress. But the feeling of unease persisted. Her heart pounded in her chest. She was terrified and had to do everything to hide it, to let the little girl continue. After being satisfied with the tying, Emily pulled her own chair back, positioned in the back of it, facing Elizabeth's chair. Both chairs were small child Ren's plastic chairs. Elizabeth wasn't a large person, and she preferred sitting at their level. Then the girl climbed onto the chair right behind Elizabeth. She couldn't see Emily, but she felt the small shoulder brushing against her back, as if the girl were reaching down to adjust her dark pink knee-high sock. At this point, Elizabeth began to tremble. Adrenaline surged through her blood. Her mouth tasted metallic. She could hear her blood roaring in her ears. These were still the early minutes of the therapy session, and no one else was in the building besides her and Emily leaned forward, small arms wrapping around Elizabeth's neck, and whispered with unmistakable malice right into her. "It's for your own good." Elizabeth could barely grasp what happened next. In an instant, the tinny hand slid across her throat, and Elizabeth couldn't believe it was real. Her neck and chest became instantly cold. She tried to speak, but her vocal cords refused to work. She heard a faint gurgling sound as air escaped from her throat. Another mouth. She looked down and saw a dark red patch forming on her shirts, oaking the entire front. Blood, her blood. Elizabeth began struggling and thrashing. She fell to the floor and was horrified to realize Emily had tied her hands far tighter than Shiver expected from a 3-year-old. In this moment, the girl was no longer a child. Elizabeth was the helpless one. She tried kicking hard to topple the chair Emily was standing on, and it fell with a cheap plastic thud. Elizabeth lay on her side, her blood pooling everywhere. Unable to produce any sound, she tried looking up, catching a glimpse of the girl staring down at her. Emily's black eyes gleamed. She was smiling. Elizabeth caught a glimpse of something metallic in Emily's hand as the girl tucked it back into her sock. Elizabeth's mind spun with chaotic questions. How did Hegel get tack knife? How was this happening? Her entire body began to grow cold. She felt like she was sinking into icy dark water, unable to breathe. Even the warm blood around her felt freezing. Her lids grew impossibly heavy, and she tried to scream one last time. The cut in her throat produced only a bubbling gurgle. Her lids slammed shut like iron doors. In the final moments of her fading consciousness, she thought she heard footsteps and a door opening, then closing. She had a fleeting hope that Emily's foster parents had arrived. Maybe she would be saved, and everything faded into darkness. Here is your full text rewritten exactly as written in English. One continuous line. No added or removed words. No line breaks. No bullet points. Elizabeth Reed woke up in the hospital 3 weeks later. When Emily's foster parents came to pick her up, they found Emily sitting calmly, emotionless like a doll in Elizabeth's waiting room. Elizabeth was discovered the next morning by a client. She was still alive, but barely. The doctors had tried to stitch her throat back together, but she had lost so much blood she had nearly died. She had been in a coma for the past 3 weeks. As horrifying details surfaced, Elizabeth realized how lucky she truly was. A few days after she was attacked, Emily's foster parents were found. Their throats had also been slit while they slept. Elizabeth speculated that perhaps they had not been willing to play the murder game with Emily and were tied up like she had been. However, they were not as fortunate as her. They were found dead. What chilled Elizabeth the most was a detail at the scene. There was a cube of milk on each bedside table. She had poured milk into their mouths as they were dying. The milk had run out of the cuts on their throats, mixing with the blood soaking the sheets. The killing of the foster parents and the attempt on Elizabeth's life seemed to solidify the gang-related theory in the minds of the police. Based on this conclusion, Emily was placed under witness protection. Her name was changed, and she was moved to an undisclosed location. New note: then Lydia Green, the social worker who had followed the case, was told where Elizabeth was also not permitted to know. She tried speaking to the police, but they looked at her with sympathy, brushing her words aside as trauma-induced delusion. They believed what she described was a hallucination caused by her own injury. They expressed gratitude that little Emily had escaped the scene before the killer, whom they believed to be a professional hitman, arrived and had managed to hide under the bed when her foster parents were murdered. They thought Elizabeth should be grateful for that, but she was not. She tried to explain that trauma rarely causes hallucinations, but every attempt failed. Noon would believe that a 3-year-old girl was a brutal murderer, no matter how many degrees she had. After recovering, Elizabeth immediately left the city and changed her name once more. She joined a clinic that allowed her to work alongside several other colleagues, so she would never have to be alone. She quit drinking milk entirely and did everything possible to forget Emily, her parents, and the entire nightmare, the alarm loop. 3 years after moving, she received a horrifying reminder. She was sitting at her desk in her new apartment in another city, reviewing her notes for the day. The phone rang, her heart clenched, and she could feel the skin around her throat's car heating up. As she reached for the phone, she noticed the time, nearly 9 p. Hello, her voice trembling. She no longer tried to hide the fear. She listened to the voice on the other end for a few moments before dropping the receiver and screaming. Panic rose in her gut, quickly overtaking her entire body. Within minutes, she grabbed a handbag and ran out the door, leaving everything else behind. The caller was a local social worker. She wanted Elizabeth to help with an extremely severe case. A 6-year-old girl had been found locked inside an apartment with the corpse of her foster mother. It was when the social worker mentioned the slit throat and the milk at the scene that Elizabeth dropped the phone and screamed. She changed her name again, and this time moved to another country. Here is your text rewritten exactly as written in English. One continuous line. No added or removed words, no line breaks, no bullet points. A life haunted, and the final warning. At present, Elizabeth works as a server at a local bar. No more children, no more milk. She suffers panic attacks whenever she sees a glass of milk, hears a phone ring, or sees a child sitting too still. It has been 10 years since the most recent incident. This morning, she walked past a teenage girl on the street. The girl was beautiful with black hair and deep, cold, haunting black eyes. There was no way to know for certain whether it was Emily or not, but Elizabeth is packing her bags and changing her name once again. It is for my own good. 3 weeks of coma, followed by several weeks of physical recovery, were a period of mental torment for Dr. Elizabeth Reed. As her body gradually healed, her mind began to operate again with ruthless precision, relentlessly analyzing the case that the police had stubbornly closed under the gang-related theory. The impossibility of the case. Elizabeth lay on the hospital bed, staring at the stark white ceiling, trying to piece together the last fragments of memory. She knew exactly what she had experienced. She had once been a psychological scientist, relying on evidence and logic, yet what Emily had done defied all laws of physics and child psychology. Physical strength. How could a 3-year-old and later 6-year-old child possess the physical strength and skill to effectively restrain an adult? The cheap jump rope, seemingly harmless, had tied her wrists so tightly that she could not struggle. Even a 4 or 5-year-old could not have managed this. The hidden weapon. The most horrifying detail was the knife or sharp metal object. How could Emily have brought a deadly weapon into a therapist's office undetected? The only possibility was that it had been cleverly concealed. Elizabeth had seen the glint of metal as the girl stuffed it into her sock. But even so, the speed and precision with which she drew it and struck the carotid artery demonstrated an astonishing mastery, far beyond the actions of a child. Survival time. The police ignored the fact that Emily had survived 2 weeks without dehydration or malnutrition. She showed no signs of panic or hunger. If she couldn't open the door, what did she eat? Police suggested she might have found snacks, but this did not explain the suspiciously good health of the child. The choice of the killer. This analysis sent chills down her spine. If Emily was not the victim, but the perpetrator, what was her motive? The phrase, "it's for their benefit," was no longer a mere repetition of a gang-related killer's words. It was Emily's mission statement. She did not kill out of hatred or material gain. She killed for some ritualistic or cult-like reason. And this is where milk played a crucial role. Milk, a symbol of nurture, purity, and childhood innocence, had become an essential part of the killing ritual. The first time, she tried to pour milk into her deceased parents' mouths and attempt to heal them. The second time, cups of milk were carefully placed beside her foster parents' beds before their deaths. Elizabeth began researching ancient heresies, black magic rituals, and obscure belief systems. She found nothing directly connecting milk and death, yet the idea of the most innocent substance being corrupted to achieve the most sinister purpose haunted her. Milk was not a weapon. It was a mark, a statement that the act was necessary and pure according to some twisted logic. Emily did not see herself as a murderer. She saw herself as performing a sacrifice for their benefit. Pain beyond trauma. When the police insisted her testimony was merely a trauma-induced hallucination, Dr. Reed felt betrayed by both the system she had served and her own scientific field. She was a trauma expert. She knew the difference between flashbacks and hallucinations. What she experienced was real, not a product of her mind. The police's disbelief not only ruined the case, but also eroded her ability to perceive reality steadily. If no one believed Emily was the perpetrator, then she remained out there, protected by the legal system. Elizabeth felt as though she was not just running from Emily, but fleeing a truth no one dared face. She changed her name and city, choosing a workplace where she would never be alone. A desperate effort to avoid the isolation that had allowed Emily to get close to her. She discarded all milk, all dairy products. The icy sensation of her throat wound was now triggered by anything reminding her of corrupted innocence. A pink princess dress, a white stuffed animal, and most horrifyingly, the innocent white of milk. The 3-year cycle. The call about a similar case 3 years later was no coincidence, but a completed curse. The 3-year-old girl was now 6, and her name had been changed. Yet the signature remained, the cutthroat and milk. This time, Elizabeth didn't need to analyze. She didn't need theories. She just needed to survive. Panic was no longer simple fear. It was pure, instinctive survival. She was no longer a doctor. She was prey. She was not running from a child. She was running from a force, a brutal entity hidden in the form of a child, one who had chosen her as a witness and near victim to assert her power. Elizabeth knew that each time Emily killed and was placed under protection, she would be given a new name, a new identity, and the cycle would continue. The girl would grow up, be nurtured, and at some point kill her next foster family using the milk and blood ritual. And Elizabeth would always be the one who knew the truth, condemned to run forever. She abandoned her career, identity, and ordinary life. Her pediatric psychology career had ended because of the most extreme case she had ever studied. From now on, you asked me to rewrite exactly what you send in English, with no added or removed words, in one continuous line, no line breaks, no bullet points. Below is your text rewritten exactly as instructed. After the Skund attack, Elizabeth Reed was no longer a professional doctor. She was a permanent fugitive hunted by a truth Noon believed. She had changed her name for the 3rd time and moved to another continent. She sold her apartment, her car, and everything that reminded her of her old life. Her only goal now was to survive and stay hidden. She chose a low-skill job, part-time work in a local bar. The noisy, crowded nightlife of the bar helped her avoid the dangerous isolation where silence could invite death. Her life was controlled by obsessions and rigid, self-imposed rules. No children. She was always cautious and avoid all contact with children, especially girls who seemed too obedient, too quiet. No milk was poison. She could not bear its innocent white color. It reminded her of blood tainted and ritual cruelty. Just seeing a glass of milk triggered a panic attack, making the scare in her neck feel like it was burning. Nolan lines. The sharp ring of a landline phone was the sound that foretold disaster, the sign that a social worker was seeking help for another, extremely severe case. She lived with sudden panic attacks, moments when her heart pounded and cold sweat broke out. The scar on her neck was a map of trauma, a physical reminder that she had once been very close to death. Her career, reputation, and stability had been taken away by a girl the world believed to be an innocent victim. She knew she could not rely on the police. Her testimony had been dismissed as trauma-induced hallucination and would never be reopened. She had to become the only detective in her own case. She knew Emily, now with a new name and identity, would be placed with another foster family. The girl would live a perfectly normal life for a few years, learn to adapt, and then the cycle would repeat. Each time the girl grew older, her ability to hide and strike became more sophisticated. At age 3, she tied up. Reed, at age 6, she made the police believe a professional killer was at work. When she reached adolescence, she would be a perfect phantom and untraceable murderer, Elizabeth. wondered whether Emily was possessed, taken over by an evil entity, or if she was a congenital psychopath of the most terrifying kind of creature wearing the mask of childhood, born only to kill and corrupt innocence with the ritual of milk and blood. She leaned toward the second theory. The doll-like numbness, the flashes of rage, the smile after the attack, and the ability to mimic innocence perfectly were clear signs of organized, calculated criminality. 10 years had passed since the last time she had to run. 10 years in the life of a growing girl, Emily, if a live was now. A teenager this morning as she walked down the street to the bar it happened. She walked past a teenage girl. The girl was beautiful with black hair and a tall figure. She did not look at her, but hair, yes, sweeping coldly across everything made Elizabeth stop, and those eyes, dark brown, almost pitch black, carrying a sharp depth far beyond her age. There was no way to know for sure if it was Emily. Now ounds na milk na screams. Just a glance, a chill down her spine, a silent acknowledgement from the past. But Elizabeth did not dare gamble. Experience had taught her that coincidence didn't exist in Emily's world. The girl's appearance, even by chance, was a cruel warning that the cycle was about to restart. She returned to her small apartment. Without thinking, she began packing. She no longer needed mail IDs or any property, just a small bag with cash, medicine, and basic essentials. She would change her name again, change her country again, or receive a trace of her existence again. She stared at the half-packed bag, feeling the bone-deep exhaustion of a life shortened by relentless fear. She could not defeat the girls. She could only run from her. And dash. He locked the door, preparing to step into the uncertain darkness. She whispered that phrase not to the girl but to herself as a final justification for the destruction of her own life. "It is for my own good." She knew that as long as Emily lived and remained free, her life would forever be an endless escape, a terrifying curse, where innocence had become the most perfect murder weapon.